mentor, Sandra. Hi, my mentee is Lilah. She's an intelligent, very organized, very enthusiastic, fun person to get to know. She has a wide range of interests, including and abilities, including art, music, environmental sciences, engineering. She even took part in a Rube Goldberg engineering competition where her team's robot got the People's Choice Award. I am not a data scientist, but Lilah wanted to do a data science project. I've also been interested in what data visualization and mapping could teach you. So, but I've never had the time or inclination to actually go and figure out how to do it. But thanks to Lilah and a lot of work and some frustration, we learned a lot. So here to tell you about it is Lilah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lilah. I'm a 10th grader at Fieldston, and I'm very excited to share what we've been working on for the past few months. Next slide, please. So a little bit about my mentor, Sandra. She works at Oracle as a software engineer and test. She's originally from Vancouver, Canada, but she has worked in Japan, Chicago, and Boston. After some discussion, I learned that her favorite and most interesting place was living and working in Japan. And in her free time, she enjoys biking, working out, crocheting, and drawing. Next slide, please. So for the project we've been working on for the past few months, we made an interactive map that visually presents air quality throughout New York City, and this used hourly air quality data. So we did it for the year of 2023. So this specifically presents data from January 1st, 2023 to December 31st, 2023. And then this is just an image, but I'll go into that later. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background. PM 2.5, what I'll be speaking about, is particulate matter particles with a diameter less than or equal to 2.5 microns. And particles that of the size of less than 10 microns are inhalable and have adverse health effects. And some of these include premature death, reduced lung function, reduced lung growth in children, and brain inflammation, other neuropathology. So this is very bad. And then AQI, the air quality index, is a scale from 0 to 500 that measures air pollution. And the higher the number, the greater the level of air pollution. And an AQI of 201 or higher is considered very unhealthy for all people. Next slide, please. So for the interactive map we created, we used data from the New York City.gov environmental health portal. And the data we used was comprised of 12 air quality monitors across New York City. And this data included the observation time, the value, the concentration of particulate matter, and the site ID, which is specific to each monitor across New York. And to do this, we coded in Python, and we used the platform Jupyter Notebook and the specific library Folium. And then I also was able to learn more about air quality monitoring systems across New York City. And in order to do this, we had to do a lot of combining and editing of data sets. Next slide, please. So I'll just take you through the code quickly. So this is all on Jupyter Notebook. And so we used the Python library Folium and a lot of the plugins that encompass. So first, we uploaded all the data sets. This first one is showing the locations of the monitors across New York City. Then that loaded in, and we did that for every monitor across New York City. We had to replace the site ID with the longitude and latitude of each location just because the heat map function that we used in Folium required longitude and latitude. And this proved quite difficult because not much data has specific longitude and latitude locations. So being able to find specific data sets that we had the locations of the monitor and was able to input that in and find the longitude and latitude of each monitor was very important to this process. So then we replaced the site IDs. So those were specific to each monitor across New York City. And there were about 12, so it wasn't too much of a process, but it definitely was difficult. And we replaced each of those site IDs with the longitude and latitude to be able to plot those points on the map. And this is just the data. We combined from the full year of 2023. So that's hourly data from each day of each month in 2023. So then we added that to a map in Folium, just the way that it works. It has preloaded maps that you can customize the locations, the specific areas that you want to focus on, and more. So we load in that data, and that's what we got. This took a very long time. This is also our second file. The first one crashed because we had so much on it. But after a lot of trial and error, this is what we got. But then we realized that the heat map was not the best way to represent the data, as I'll explain later. So we made a line graph to represent this data, just focusing on the data that was collected in Manhattan, because we noticed that had the most fluctuations throughout the year. And then we just did some editing on that. But you'll see those up close a little later. Next slide, please. So this is a heat map with time that plots hourly air quality data in New York City for the year of 2023. This is kind of long, so I increased the frames per second, so it is quite fast. But just to see a general idea of what the map looks like. So these are the different monitor locations, each year with the main red circles. Most concentrated were around the monitor site, so that's what you see here. And then here shows you the specific day, month, year, day, month, and the time. And then because this is an interactive map, you're able to increase the scale. You can use the drag function and focus on a different area of the map, increase the frames per second, and then rewind, pause, and everything. And this shows scale. So I think this is enough of the video for now. The next slide has a more specific clip. So next slide, please. So this is a close-up on a specific time, and I slowed that down a little so you could see. This is from April of 2023. So yeah. And a lot of the changes you see are monitors disappearing and reappearing, and this is possibly the case because the data set, when we combined and then combined all the data sets, we had a lot of not number values that we had to replace with 0. So some of these fluctuations are caused because there's no data at a specific time. But then here you can see in this area, there are more changes that are visible. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. So this is after we realized that the heat map with time might not have been the best way to represent the data because it was pretty hard to see fluctuations throughout the year, we made a line graph to represent the PM 2.5 levels in Manhattan throughout 2023. And this was a particularly interesting year because of the events in early to mid-June and then in July. And I'll get into that later, but that is an anomaly. It's a pretty large spike. And that jump in early to mid-June is likely caused due to the Canadian wildfires. And I don't know if anybody, people who live here, if they remember, but when you walked outside, it was all yellow, all muggy. It was really out of the ordinary. So being able to see this on a line graph is especially significant because experiencing that and finally being able to see it expressed in data, it just changes the way that I'm able to view that moment and then moving forward air quality in New York. So at that time, the air quality readings in the East Coast were above 400. And as I said before, air quality readings above 201 are deemed unsafe for all people. So a level double that is unimaginable. And then moving to that next spot in early July is likely due to fireworks being set off in New York City. And I did not know this was such a big risk, but after doing further research, every year around that time, there's a 42% increase in PM 2.5 levels on average, but it can also jump up to 370% increase. So it's very interesting just to see the general trends and then those spikes throughout the year. Next slide, please. So then after we saw that with the large spike in June, we wanted to see if there were any general trends that were going on throughout the year and then comparing that to other years. So on the left, this is a graph we found from berkeleyEarth.org, which had 2 decades worth of particulate matter air pollution data, and that's from 2004 to 2023. And then on the right, we have our graph that we made, but we filtered out that anomaly. So we filtered out data points that are above 100 micrograms per cubic meter. And then that was able to show us more general trends. And then that did line up with the other data we found. But then also when we were looking at this from berkeley-earth.org, we saw that there was a decrease from 2008 on, and we decided to explore that more just to see why that was the case. And we found that starting in 2008, maybe a little after, there were many new city initiatives that were focused on becoming greener and more climate conscious. And so we found like the planned New York City goal of lowering emissions by 30% by 2017, but then also the introductions of city bikes to New York in 2013. So that was like an explanation we found and hypothesized of why they were decreasing particulate matter 2.5 concentrations at that time. But then we also noticed, because this only has per year, but being able to trace and like break it up into different sections, we found that there were higher levels of particulate matter in colder months. And we found due to research that it's because of the colder, drier air being able to trap pollution more easily, but also an increase in the use of fossil fuels, like through traveling, heating, just in the winter. And then we saw some other spikes. So besides the very obvious spike in 2023 due to the Canadian wildfires, there's also a spike in 2021. And we hypothesized that could be due to the pickup of normal activities after COVID, like increased tourism and people going out and doing things. But it was really seeing both of these data sets like next to each other and the way they were represented, just seeing that spike in 2023, I really didn't realize how awful it actually was until being able to see this data in real time. Okay, next slide, please. So for future steps, it would be really interesting to use different Python libraries of ways of representing the data to be able to see how that impacts the way that data is perceived. That really relies on how the data is represented best. So in the case of the data we use, it ended up being best represented using line graphs to see like the more intricate changes. But the heat map was a very interesting process. And I think going forward, other data might be better, but it didn't provide more insights. Then also using more expansive data. The data we used came from 12 monitors across New York City. And then some of the data wasn't even usable because of when it was combined, it was like not a number value and we had to filter that out. And then also being able to layer on other data sets to that map would be really interesting to be able to see like cause and effects between air pollution, possibly like socioeconomic status, and air quality trends, and then also health conditions. Going into like the whole magic process, I was really excited. I had a lot of like ambitious goals. Like I'm gonna make so many layers on this map. I'm gonna be able to see this and that. And while we didn't actually end up hitting all of those goals, I think now I'm at a great start to be able to add onto the map and be able to see more changes that goes on throughout New York City, and then maybe even in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. So my magical experience. So there were a lot of challenges, lessons learned, and many, many highlights. One of the first challenges that we came across just in the first few weeks of collecting data was it was very hard to find a singular data set that had all the information we needed. Just because the way the heat map worked out, you needed to have longitude and latitude. And then also we wanted to get more expansive data that focused on specific parts of New York, specific parts of New York City. And then from there, it was hard to find like more uniform data. It was like all over the place, or it was like throughout a decade. And that just really wasn't what we were looking for. But eventually, like through the process of combining and editing data sets, we were able to get to that point. But that was definitely a challenge at first. And then another one was a jump from coding shapes and simple programs to data analysis. So for the first few weeks of Magic, I had no Python experience. I honestly had not much coding experience at all besides like Scratch and like block coding. So it was definitely a shock when we started. And in the first 2 weeks, I learned how to code like shapes and colors, and I made like a blue star spin in a circle. And I was like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to get to a point where I can actually show the data that I want to show? But it really, once we started and once we began to work, Sandra was just such an incredible teacher. I was so lucky to have a great mentor. that I really learned so much and I was able to grow in so many different ways. So some of the lessons learned, and these are both kind of cheesy, but like the value of perseverance, there were so many times where like the data sets wouldn't work, the heat map wouldn't load, and it's just one thing after another. And then there's also more than one way to get to the final answer. That was definitely a large lesson learned. Especially after we couldn't find the data sets and we needed to combine everything and it wouldn't combine, then we had no number values. We were able to work around that. And one of the ways we actually did was we used a little bit of AI. And it was an interesting experience because the way that AI is shown in schools is like really like no cheating. And so that was something I was definitely keeping in mind as I was working through these issues. But like running out like a simple thing through ChatGPT, which we didn't think would work, it actually gave us a great solution. And we were able to use what we learned from that and apply that to other moments when we didn't know how to solve specific issues, because there were many issues that continuously arose. So we were able to deal with those towards the end. And then some highlights. When the heat map finally displayed the data we prepared, there were many times when the heat map didn't show up, it didn't show the data, it didn't work. So when it finally worked, it was a monumentous moment. And then also when Python began to click, going into it, I wasn't really sure what to expect as I didn't have much prior experience. But seeing that, like I love learning languages. I love being able to like learn something new. So when I realized that Python was a very logical language, it like all began to click and I began to have more fun with it and being like less stressed around it. But it was just a great experience. And then lastly, getting to know my incredible mentor, Sandra. It was so interesting to learn about like her life experiences and what it meant to have a career in STEM. So it was definitely a new experience and I loved every minute of it. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for listening. I'm so happy to be able to share this with you all. Oh, if anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Yes, Alkia.
So I have a question. I really had the privilege of getting to watch you work through, even like in an airport lounge, like a lot of music difficulties that you're having with Python that then obviously were conducive to this result. So what do you think would be like your advice to people that are first trying to learn Python or a new coding language that are feeling maybe like disheartened by like something's not showing up, like you said, or the heat map, and like I know you talked about the value of perseverance. Like what are some of the ways that that manifests in like the coding itself?
Ooh, okay, so Saskia's questions was like, I spoke about the value of perseverance and how that was shown during, like within Python, like the coding, like within coding. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, like how that was shown within like the experience of coding. I think just going to like the second point that I was talking about how there's more than one way to get to the answer you're trying to get to or the result you're trying to achieve. I think that's definitely the case. Because Python is an entirely different language, it is difficult at first with not much experience to figure out different ways, as there's like a few things that you learn at the beginning that you just try to apply over and over again. But there are many ways, and then through education and through like learning more about Python and what you can do with Python as well as limitations, it is definitely a process, but it's always possible to get to any result. Any other questions? Yeah.
Fantastic job. I've really enjoyed this. I think you said there are 12 monitoring stations in New York City, correct? So I'm curious, just based on you playing with data sets and learning about monitoring stations, do you think 12 is enough to gain a robust data set to model particular matter in the city?
Well, this was just from the one data set we were looking at that had these like sites that were readily available, that information that we needed to be able to find longitude and latitude data. So in the grand scheme of things for this particular data set, I don't think 12 monitor sites were enough, just because there's so many parts of New York City and there's like the fluctuations within the different parts of the city and then also throughout the year can't accurately be captured from just 12 monitor sites. But because these aren't like the only people collecting data, there are many more ways that they're collecting data. So it's definitely, I think definitely within this data set and in the grand scheme of things, 12 is definitely not enough. But considering the fact that there are people all over New York City and other parts of the world using other ways to collect this data, I think it really depends on. Yeah.
Great job, and I love your point about AI. I think we're at the cusp of really rethinking how we're gonna teach it, and I think it's a good point. It's not about cheating, right? It's just about supporting everything else. But I have a question about, similar to Mr. Getz's question. Did you find that certain areas in the city had worse quality, air quality compared to others, and do you attribute it to any other reasons, like socioeconomics or, other things that related to quality of life? Did you, extract any other observations or more like, in that sense of like how people are living in parts like south versus north versus Manhattan versus, I don't know, how far north you went and that kind of stuff.
Okay, so the question was whether or not I found that there was any difference within parts of New York City with the pollution that I saw within the data. So going into this project, I did have a fair bit of background on the socioeconomic breakdown of New York City, and then the effects that has, like wealth distribution, and then also the distribution of places or objects that emit a lot of pollutants within New York City. So I was aware that in lower income parts of New York City, there's a higher prevalence of pollutants. But going through this data, it was actually a very different process. And I know that that is a fact and that other data does support it. But for some reason, the data that we used just based off of the monitor sites didn't support that same idea. I do think that is like what Mr. Getz was saying, like how not having enough monitor sites impacted that data. But going into the project, like I said before, I did want to show more than just one thing on this map. And because that wasn't really a possibility with like a lack of time, but also just the amount of time it took to find a singular data set that we could use, there are many more connections that can be made that just aren't represented in this data. Thank you.